A veteran and his dog bought an abandoned castle, then uncovered a family secret. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was the kind of place that only whispered its secrets in the quietest of moments. The old castle stood tall atop the craggy hills, its ancient stone walls weathered and worn, overlooking a valley that had long since abandoned any signs of life. With the harsh winter winds cutting through the trees and the sound of distant howling echoing across the barren land, the castle seemed like something forgotten by time itself. It had been years since anyone had dared to call it home, and the local townspeople had long given up even talking about it. That was until a veteran and his loyal dog, Max, decided to make it their own. Having seen the horrors of war and lost almost everything that once mattered to him, Mark, the veteran, was looking for a fresh start. He had nowhere else to go. His only companion was Max, a German shepherd who had been by his side through thick and thin, serving with him in countless missions and always coming home by his side. Together, they'd shared more than just battles. They'd shared a bond that neither war nor time could break. But the moment they set eyes on the abandoned castle, something inside Mark told him it was meant to be. It was a sign. Mark wasn't sure why, but there was something about the place that spoke to him, something that stirred the old instincts he'd long buried. The owner had put it up for sale at a ridiculously low price, far below its worth, and something told Mark this might be his only shot at finding peace. With little more than the savings he had left from his pension, Mark made the purchase, and so they moved in. The first few days were quiet, eerily quiet. Max seemed uneasy, pacing the long, cold halls, his ears constantly twitching as though he was listening for something just beyond his hearing. Mark chalked it up to the strange, abandoned nature of the place. There were creaks in the walls, distant thuds, and the wind howling through the cracked windows. But what unsettled Mark the most was the feeling that he wasn't alone. Late one night, as Mark sat by the fire, sipping his coffee and thinking about the life he had left behind, Max suddenly froze. His body tensed, his tail straightened, and he stared intently at the far corner of the room. Mark followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Only the shadows, dancing in the dim light from the fireplace. But then, there was a sound, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. A voice. At first, Mark thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, the wind carrying strange sounds through the castle. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. There was something else, something human. Max's behavior grew more erratic, barking at nothing, his eyes darting to dark corners of the room. Mark had to know what was going on. He started digging into the history of the castle. He uncovered a name, the Barrett family, the same name that was on the deed he had signed. The more Mark researched, the more he uncovered. The Barretts were once a wealthy family, but they had mysteriously vanished without a trace many years ago. The castle had been abandoned ever since, with no one daring to return. As Mark delved deeper, he found an old diary hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded with age, but the words written inside shook him to his core. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor Barrett, the daughter of the castle's original owner. She described strange occurrences, voices in the walls, and the eerie feeling that something, or someone, was watching her every move. And then, the final entry. They've come back. I fear what they are going to do next. Please, someone help us. Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The family secret was out. But what was it? Who had come back? And what did they want from him? As the last light of day faded from the sky, Mark stood in the grand hall, staring at the darkening corners of the castle. He could feel the eyes of the past upon him, waiting for the story to unfold. Max stood beside him, his body tense, as though waiting for the next chapter of the mystery to reveal itself. The following morning, Mark awoke to the sound of Max's soft growl, low and steady, as though something was stirring in the shadows. He stretched, groggy from a restless night, filled with dreams of distant voices. Something about the castle was different now. It wasn't just the whispers, nor the feeling of being watched. There was a growing weight in the air, a sense that the past was reaching out to touch him. As the sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the room, Mark knew that he had to uncover more. He couldn't ignore it any longer. It was time to find out the truth behind the Barrett family and their disappearance. Mark walked through the grand halls, his footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. Max followed close behind, his eyes alert, constantly scanning the room as if he sensed something beyond the physical world. They approached the old library, the place where Mark had first discovered the diary. The room was large, filled with dusty shelves of forgotten books, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Mark sat down at the old wooden desk where he had found Eleanor Barrett's diary. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with questions. Why had the Barretts vanished? What had happened to them? He flipped through the pages of the diary again, his fingers brushing over the delicate paper. As he read the final entry aloud in the dim light, his voice trembled slightly. They've come back. I fear what they are going to do next. Please, someone help us. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Mark's heart raced as he tried to process what he was reading. Had they truly come back? And if so, who or what were they? Max suddenly barked, his tail stiff, and Mark turned to see the dog's eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He stood up slowly, walking towards the spot where Max was staring. There was nothing there, but the air felt colder, heavier. He could almost feel the presence of something, or someone, hidden just out of sight. Mark reached out, his hand trembling as he brushed against the cold stone wall. He ran his fingers along the rough surface, and that's when he felt it. A slight indentation. A hidden door. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he pressed against the wall, and a small section of the stone slid open with a soft click. A hidden passageway. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pull him in, but Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he knew, deep down, that this was the key to unlocking the mystery. With Max by his side, Mark stepped into the passage. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the air was thick with dust. It felt as if time had stood still here for decades. The passage led them down a narrow staircase, and Mark's flashlight flickered as he descended further into the darkness. He could hear the sound of his breath, the soft scrape of Max's paws on the stone steps, and the distant hum of something that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was the same hum that had echoed through the castle the night before. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Mark found himself in what looked like a forgotten chamber. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in white sheets, as if the castle's previous inhabitants had left in a hurry. Dust motes floated in the stale air, and a musty smell lingered. In the center of the room was a large, wooden chest, its edges worn with age. Mark approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down, his hands shaking as he slowly opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in layers of old cloth, was a collection of letters, their edges yellowed with age. Mark carefully unwrapped them, his fingers trembling as he opened the first letter. The writing was elegant, but it was the contents that struck him. The letter was addressed to Eleanor Barrett, and it spoke of a family secret, one that had been hidden for generations. It was a secret so dark that it had driven the Barrett family to hide it away, even from their own children. Mark's mind raced as he read the letter aloud. The truth must never be known. If it is, we will all suffer. The curse of the Barrett family must remain buried, or it will consume us all. A curse? Mark's stomach tightened as he read the final lines. Do not let anyone find the castle's hidden treasure. It is the key to everything, and it will bring ruin to those who seek it. Max barked again, louder this time, and Mark snapped his head up. He felt the temperature drop, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. It was clear now, he was not alone. The presence was here, in this very room. Mark slowly stood up, clutching the letter in his hand. He knew that whatever secrets the castle held, he had just scratched the surface. But one thing was certain. The Barrett family's dark past was far from over, and the curse they had left behind was not done with him yet. The atmosphere in the hidden chamber grew thicker with tension as Mark stood frozen, the letter still in his hand. Max, his faithful German shepherd, was growling softly, his body rigid and his eyes trained on the far corner of the room. Mark knew that whatever had been sealed away in this castle was not just a relic of the past, it was alive. The words from the letter echoed in his mind. Do not let anyone find the castle's hidden treasure. It is the key to everything, and it will bring ruin to those who seek it. He had to know more, but part of him warned against digging any deeper. It was as if the castle itself was urging him to stop. But Mark couldn't. He had already crossed too far into the mystery, and the pull to uncover the truth was too strong. He could feel the weight of the curse hanging over him, a force he couldn't explain, but one that was undeniably real. Slowly, he moved toward the far side of the room, where an old, dusty mirror hung crookedly on the wall. Something about it felt off, almost too deliberate in its placement, as if it was meant to be noticed. Mark's hand reached out instinctively. As soon as his fingers brushed against the cold glass, the room seemed to shift. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and for a split second, Mark thought he could hear faint whispers, like the voice of Eleanor Barrett herself calling to him from beyond the grave. Max barked sharply, snapping Mark out of his trance. The dog was now staring intently at the mirror, his body tense with alertness. Mark stepped back, feeling a strange shiver crawl down his spine. Something wasn't right. He had to act fast. Mark reached into his pocket for the flashlight, casting a beam of light across the mirror's surface. As the light hit the glass, the reflection shimmered unnaturally, and Mark saw something that made his heart race. Behind him, a door he had not noticed before was slowly creaking open. The door led into another room, one that had been hidden from view. He glanced at Max, who was now whimpering, backing away from the mirror. Stay close, buddy, Mark whispered, his voice steady despite the knot of fear tightening in his chest. As he stepped toward the door, the sound of footsteps echoed from within. They were slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking toward him. Mark paused for a moment, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He wasn't alone. He pushed the door open further, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, filled with dust and cobwebs, and the air was thick with the scent of age. But there, in the center of the room, was something he never expected to see. A large, intricately carved chest, its surface adorned with strange symbols and markings that Mark couldn't quite understand. As if guided by an unseen force, he stepped forward, his hands trembling as he approached the chest. Max, still at his side, began to bark wildly, his warning a sharp contrast to the eerie silence that had settled in the room. Mark ignored the warning signs. He had come this far. He had to know what lay within. He slowly crouched down and unlatched the chest, the creaking sound of the old wood making his skin crawl. Inside, there was nothing but a simple, dust-covered book. The cover was old and worn, with gold lettering that had faded over time. Mark opened the book, and immediately, he felt a rush of cold air surround him. The pages were filled with cryptic symbols, many of which seemed to match the markings on the chest. As he flipped through the pages, a feeling of dread washed over him. The book told the story of the Barrett family, but it was not just any history. It was a record of dark rituals, ancient secrets, and a power that had been sealed away for centuries. Eleanor Barrett, it seemed, had been part of a lineage cursed with knowledge that should never have been uncovered. But the more Mark read, the more he realized that the curse wasn't just a warning, it was a prophecy. The final page of the book was a chilling one. It read, "Only one can break the curse. But be warned, the price of doing so is more than anyone can bear." As Mark finished reading the last words, the room around him seemed to shift. The floor beneath him groaned, and the walls seemed to close in. Max barked desperately, his eyes wide with fear. Mark turned to leave, but the door had slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. He was trapped. The curse had awakened, and Mark realized then that he wasn't just uncovering a family secret. He was now a part of it. The journey he had started had led him here, but he had no idea where it would take him next. What had he unleashed? And what would he have to sacrifice to stop it? The air in the hidden chamber was suffocating as Mark struggled to pry open the door that had slammed shut. Max, still barking frantically, was circling him, desperate to get out of the room. The walls seemed to close in on Mark, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. Something was happening, something ancient and powerful that he had awakened with his curiosity. He could feel the temperature dropping, his breath visible in the cold air. His heart raced as he desperately tried to open the door, but it was as though something unseen was holding it shut. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to calm down. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He needed to know the truth about the Barrett family and what lay hidden in this cursed castle. Max's barking stopped suddenly, and Mark turned to see his dog standing still, his body rigid, his eyes locked on something behind Mark. Mark's pulse quickened as he slowly turned around, dreading what he might find. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a shadowy shape, barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, and it was watching him. Mark's blood ran cold as the figure slowly stepped forward. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a face that seemed familiar but at the same time, distant. His eyes were hollow, empty, and yet they seemed to pierce through Mark with an unsettling intensity. Mark's breath hitched as the figure spoke, his voice a low, haunting whisper. "You should not have come here," the figure said. Mark could barely hear him over the pounding of his own heart. "The curse of the Barrett family is not something that can be undone. You are too late." Mark took a step back, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaky. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his cold eyes never leaving Mark's. "I am the one who witnessed the downfall of the Barrett family," the figure replied. "I was there when they sealed their fate, and now you are here, awakening the very thing they tried to bury." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. He had been warned. Eleanor's diary, the book with its cryptic symbols, all of it had pointed to this moment. But nothing had prepared him for this. This figure, this spirit, or whatever it was, that had been trapped in the castle for so long. "What is it you want from me?" Mark demanded, his voice steadier now, though his body trembled with fear. The figure's lips curled into a grim smile. "What I want has no bearing on you," he said. "But what you will do, what you have already done, will decide whether you live or die." Mark's eyes narrowed. "I won't be your pawn," he said, though deep down, he feared he already was. The figure's smile faded, and his eyes seemed to burn with an intense fire. "Then you are already doomed," he said, his voice cold and final. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls trembled, the ground beneath Mark's feet began to shake, and the whispers grew louder, now joined by a deep, rumbling sound, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. Max whined and backed away, his eyes wide with terror. Mark's heart pounded as the figure raised his hand, and a strange light filled the room. It wasn't the light of a candle or lantern, but a strange, unnatural glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the castle. "You are not prepared for what lies ahead," the figure said. "But it is too late. The curse has already claimed you." The ground shook violently, and Mark stumbled as the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls cracked, revealing something deep beneath the castle, something vast and dark. Mark's eyes widened as he saw the truth, a massive, underground vault, filled with golden treasures, but that wasn't what held his attention. In the center of the vault was a large, ornate chest, the same chest from the diary, the one that held the key to the family's secrets. But as he looked closer, Mark saw something even more terrifying. What lay inside the chest was not treasure, but a twisted, ancient creature, its eyes glowing with malice. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as the figure's voice echoed in his mind. "You have opened the door to the darkness, and now it will consume you." Mark staggered backward, his mind racing. He had no choice. He had to stop whatever this was before it was too late. He turned and ran, pushing past the figure, the ghostly presence that seemed to grow stronger the closer he got to the door. The room trembled once more as he reached the door, but this time, it opened. Mark burst through it, the blinding light of day greeting him as he stepped back into the hallway of the castle. Max followed, his fur bristling, eyes wide with fear. The castle felt different now, the silence broken by the echoes of something far darker. Mark knew he had to find a way to break the curse, to put an end to the nightmare that had begun with his curiosity. But the figure's words haunted him. He wasn't prepared for what lay ahead. And soon, Mark realized, he would have to face the darkness head-on, no matter the cost. Mark stumbled back into the grand hall of the castle, his heart racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The figure, the eerie glow, the dark presence that had followed him. It was all too much. Max, ever loyal, stayed close by his side, his fur bristling as if he, too, sensed the danger still lingering in the air. Mark could feel the weight of the curse that had been unleashed, the sense that the castle's dark history was more than just a tale. It was a living, breathing force that was now tied to him. He knew he couldn't stay here much longer. He had to get out, but his feet felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath him was reluctant to let him leave. The whispers still echoed through the halls, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just in his head. The castle was alive, and it was calling to him. "Max, come on," Mark muttered, his voice tight with fear as he moved toward the front door. But as he reached the entrance, he froze. The door, once wide open, was now shut tight. It was as though it had been sealed by some invisible force. Mark pressed his hand against the cold wood, frustration rising in his chest. This was not the escape he had imagined. He glanced over at Max, who was standing still, his head cocked to one side, ears twitching. Mark followed his dog's gaze to a small, ornate mirror hanging on the wall near the door. The glass was cracked, and the frame was covered in dust, but something about it seemed different, almost as if it was calling to him. Mark felt an odd compulsion to approach it. He stepped forward, his legs feeling like they were moving of their own accord. As his reflection came into view, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They seemed to emanate from the mirror itself. Mark leaned in closer, his face inches from the cracked glass. That's when he saw it. The reflection wasn't his own. Instead, he saw a woman standing in the doorway of the castle, her eyes wide with fear. She looked familiar, but Mark couldn't place her. Her hair was dark, tied back in a loose braid, and she wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind he had seen in the photographs from Eleanor Barrett's time. She raised a hand to the glass, as if trying to reach him. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the entire room seemed to tremble. The mirror shimmered, and the woman's reflection flickered, like a candle flame caught in the wind. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he whispered, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, she slowly faded from view, her face twisting into an expression of sorrow. Just before she disappeared completely, Mark saw her mouth move. The words were faint, but he heard them clearly. "Find the key." Mark's breath caught in his throat. What key? And where? The room seemed to fall silent, and for a moment, Mark wasn't sure if he had imagined the whole thing. But when he looked back at the door, it was open. The whispers had stopped, and the weight of the curse that had been pressing on him seemed to lift, just a little. Mark stepped through the doorway, and Max followed close behind. They emerged into the courtyard of the castle, the sun just beginning to set in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow across the landscape. The castle, once full of dark secrets and fear, now seemed strangely calm. Mark felt the tension in his chest begin to ease, but the question lingered. What was the key, and why had the woman appeared to him? He had to know. He couldn't leave the castle without answers. The wind rustled the trees, and Mark felt as though the castle itself was watching him, waiting for him to uncover its deepest secrets. With Max at his side, Mark knew that he couldn't run from the past any longer. He had to face whatever was hidden in the castle's depths. As he looked around the courtyard, his eyes landed on a small, overgrown path that led to the back of the castle. It was hidden behind a thicket of vines and bushes, almost as if it had been forgotten. But something inside him told him that this was the path he needed to take. He started toward it, his steps slow but determined. Max trotted beside him, his eyes alert, ears raised. They passed through the overgrown path, the air thick with the scent of moss and decay. The further they went, the more Mark felt the presence of something ancient, something waiting to be uncovered. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the castle's grounds. Finally, they came to a large, stone archway. It was cracked and worn, the stone covered in ivy, but Mark could see the faint outline of something carved into the stone. He stepped closer, brushing away the vines to reveal an inscription. It was written in the same cryptic symbols Mark had seen in the book from the chest. This was it. This was the key. Mark's fingers traced the carvings, and as he did, he felt a surge of energy course through him. The ground beneath him trembled once more, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The castle was alive. It was waiting for him to unlock its final secret. Mark knew he had to make a choice. He could walk away, leave the castle behind, and never look back. But something in his gut told him that the only way to end the curse was to face whatever lay ahead. And so, with Max by his side, Mark stepped through the archway, ready to uncover the truth once and for all. Mark stepped through the archway, the air thick with tension as the whispers seemed to grow louder, more urgent. Max trotted beside him, his ears pricked, body tense as though the very earth beneath their feet was shifting. The stones of the archway seemed to pulse with energy, and Mark could feel a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, as though the castle itself was holding its breath. They passed into a narrow hallway, the walls lined with cracked stone and faded tapestries that fluttered slightly, despite the still air. The dim light from his flashlight barely pierced the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows along the floor. Mark's heart raced, but there was no turning back now. He had to follow the path, to understand what the castle had been hiding for all these years. As he moved further into the hallway, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. He felt like he had been here before, in some distant memory, though he couldn't quite place it. His mind raced, but the path ahead was clear. The hallway eventually opened up into a large chamber, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. The room was vast, much larger than the rest of the castle, and at its center stood a pedestal, surrounded by a circle of faded runes etched into the stone floor. The pedestal was empty, but Mark could feel something was missing, something that should have been there. Max growled low, and Mark felt his stomach tighten. It was then that he noticed the wall opposite the pedestal. A large mural covered it, painted in vibrant colors despite the dust and age. The painting depicted a family, the Barretts, no doubt, and in the center, there was a figure that seemed to be the source of all the whispers. The figure was shrouded in shadow, their face obscured, but Mark could tell it was someone of great importance, someone tied to the fate of the family. As Mark approached the mural, he felt a sudden chill sweep through the room. The whispers returned, now louder than ever, and the air felt thick with unseen eyes. Max growled again, his body rigid as he faced the wall. Mark reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the mural. The moment his hand made contact, the floor beneath him trembled, and a low rumbling sound echoed through the castle. The runes on the floor began to glow faintly, and Mark staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The mural shifted, the figure in the painting slowly coming to life, its face now visible. It was Eleanor Barrett, her eyes hollow and lifeless, staring directly at him. Mark's blood ran cold as she seemed to speak, her lips moving, but no sound escaped. The words were in a language Mark didn't understand, but somehow, he could hear them in his mind. "You've come to finish what was started," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to fill the room. "You must make the choice. There is no turning back." Mark's breath caught in his throat. What choice? What was she talking about? Eleanor's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, it felt like the room itself was breathing, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening. "The key lies within," she whispered, and with a final glance, her image faded from the mural. Mark stood frozen, his mind reeling. What key? What did it all mean? He turned back to the pedestal in the center of the room. It was clear now. This was the heart of the curse, the place where the Barrett family's fate had been sealed. But what was the key? What had he missed? As he stepped closer to the pedestal, Max barked sharply, his eyes wide with alarm. Mark froze, then looked down. At first, he saw nothing, but as he knelt down, his hand brushing the dust-covered stone, his fingers touched something cold and smooth. It was a small, intricate key, buried in the dust at the base of the pedestal. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the key. But the moment his fingers closed around it, the rumbling grew louder, the castle shaking as though it was alive. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, screaming, urging him to stop. Mark pulled the key free, but the moment he did, the room seemed to come alive, the walls cracking, the floor shifting beneath him. Max barked again, tugging at Mark's sleeve, trying to pull him away. Mark didn't move, his gaze fixed on the key in his hand. The light from the runes flared brightly, illuminating the entire room in an unnatural glow. Mark's pulse raced as the ground beneath him trembled, the very air charged with power. Then, the whispers stopped. A deep, resonant voice filled the room, and Mark felt it in his bones. "You have chosen," the voice said. "Now, face the consequences." Suddenly, the room was silent again. Mark looked around, but nothing had changed. The whispers had stopped, the glow faded, and the key in his hand felt cold, as if it had lost its power. But Mark knew that the real choice had just begun. He had the key, but now, he had to decide what to do with it. What would it unlock? What doors had he just opened? Max whimpered, pulling at his sleeve again, and Mark finally stood, taking a deep breath. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. The journey was far from over. The curse wasn't done with him yet, and whatever awaited him next, he had to face it head on. With the key in his hand, Mark turned and made his way to the door at the far end of the room. Whatever lay beyond, he was ready to uncover it. Mark stood before the door, the key heavy in his hand. His mind was racing, 1,000 questions spinning in his head, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He had to move forward. The castle seemed to watch him, its ancient stone walls holding countless secrets, waiting for him to unlock them. Max stood at his side, his fur bristling, eyes darting nervously between Mark and the door. The dog knew something Mark couldn't quite grasp. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, and stepped forward. As soon as he inserted the key into the door's lock, the room around him seemed to hum with energy. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Mark hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, his flashlight illuminating the worn stone steps. The air grew colder as he descended, the whispers from earlier returning in hushed tones, echoing off the walls. The deeper he went, the more intense the feeling became, like something was drawing him further into the depths of the castle, something that had been waiting for him all along. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark found himself in a large, dimly lit chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, many of them familiar from the book and the murals he had seen earlier. In the center of the room stood an ornate stone altar, its surface cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. Mark's heart raced as he approached it. The key felt cold in his hand, as though it had absorbed the energy of the castle itself. He glanced around the chamber, his eyes narrowing as he took in the eerie stillness. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and Mark felt a chill settle over him. Suddenly, the air shifted. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. Mark spun around, his flashlight flickering as he tried to make sense of what was happening. In the far corner of the room, a shadow moved, slowly at first, then more quickly. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the figure took shape, a tall, imposing figure cloaked in darkness. It was humanoid, but something about it felt wrong. Its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, and its presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Max growled low, standing between Mark and the figure, his body tense with fear. Mark stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't face whatever this was alone. The figure took another step forward, and Mark instinctively reached for the key. It was then that he realized the truth. The key wasn't just for the door. It was for the curse. He had to use it. But how? The figure moved closer, its growl growing louder. Mark's pulse quickened. The whispers returned, but now they were louder, clearer. The key unlocks more than just the door, they said. It unlocks the power to end the curse, or to let it consume you. Mark gripped the key tighter, feeling its power surge through him. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him. It was now or never. He turned to the altar, his flashlight illuminating the stone surface. There, etched into the stone, was a symbol, one he had seen before, in the diary and the murals. It was the symbol of the Barrett family, but it was twisted, distorted, as if corrupted by dark forces. The growl behind him grew louder, and Mark knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. He had to act. Without thinking, he placed the key into the center of the symbol. The moment it made contact, the room shook violently. The stone altar cracked, and a blinding light filled the chamber, nearly blinding him. Mark stumbled backward, his eyes squeezed shut as the light grew brighter, then dimmed, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. When Mark opened his eyes, the figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. The room was empty, and yet, Mark could feel something had changed. The curse was lifting. The key, now dull and lifeless in his hand, had fulfilled its purpose. Mark took a deep breath, his heart still racing. The room was no longer filled with darkness. The oppressive air had lifted, and the castle, once a place of death and mystery, now seemed quiet, peaceful even. Max stepped forward, his body relaxed for the first time since they entered the castle. Mark knew that it wasn't over yet, but this was a victory. The curse had been broken, but the secrets of the Barrett family still lingered, hidden in the shadows. As he turned to leave the chamber, Mark looked at the altar one last time. The key had unlocked the door to the past, but now it was time to move forward, to leave the castle behind. With Max by his side, Mark stepped into the hallway, the light from his flashlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time since he arrived, he felt a glimmer of hope. The curse had been broken, but the adventure was just beginning. Mark stood in the hallway, the echoes of the broken curse still lingering in the air. The oppressive weight that had hung over him for so long had finally lifted, but the silence that followed felt heavy in its own way. Max trotted beside him, his pace steady, but his alert eyes never left the shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly along the walls of the castle. They had done it. The curse was broken. But what about the rest of the family's secrets? What had been hidden all these years, and how much of it still remained in the dark corners of this forsaken place? Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something deeper than he had yet uncovered. The key, the murals, the whispers, it all pointed to a greater truth that he hadn't yet grasped. His mind raced as he walked, each step echoing through the empty halls, but it wasn't until he reached the main foyer of the castle that he realized something had changed. The atmosphere was different. The once oppressive, suffocating air had shifted, replaced by a sense of peace, of quiet waiting. As if the castle itself had exhaled, releasing the tension that had bound it for centuries. Mark reached the large, grand window that looked out over the landscape. The sun had risen higher now, casting light across the rolling hills and dense woods beyond the castle's gates. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt a sense of connection to the land. It wasn't just a place of death and curses anymore. It was a place of history, of memories long forgotten, and of a family that had once lived and loved here. The air was filled with the scent of earth and pine, fresh and new, as if the castle was beginning to breathe again after so many years of silence. Max, ever watchful, sat at his feet, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Mark took a deep breath and made his decision. It wasn't enough to simply break the curse. He had to understand it, to honor the past that had been buried here for so long. He couldn't leave without knowing the full story of the Barrett family, of what had really happened to them, and why they had disappeared without a trace. He turned to face the grand staircase that led to the upper levels of the castle. The light from the window illuminated the dusty steps, casting long shadows on the worn wood. There were still rooms to explore, and Mark was determined to find them. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. The top of the staircase opened into a large hallway lined with portraits of long-dead family members. Their faces were stern, their eyes cold, yet Mark could sense something else beneath the surface, regret, perhaps, or sorrow. He stopped in front of one portrait in particular. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing gown, her hair pulled back into an elaborate updo. She had the same hollow eyes that Mark had seen in the mural. Eleanor Barrett. This was the woman who had warned him, who had guided him through the darkness. Mark stared at the painting for a long moment, his thoughts racing. What had happened to her? What had happened to the rest of her family? Why had they all been erased from history? The answers had to be here, somewhere. Mark turned and continued down the hallway. There were doors on either side, each leading to rooms that had been left untouched for decades, some even longer. He tried the first door on his left, finding it unlocked. Inside, the room was dark, but he could see the outlines of furniture covered in dust sheets, the once grand decor now faded and forgotten. As Mark stepped further into the room, his flashlight illuminated a large, ornate desk in the center, papers scattered across the surface. Mark's heart raced as he approached it, the feeling of discovery rising in his chest. He carefully lifted the papers, most of them brittle with age, and began to sift through them. They were letters, hundreds of them, written in a hand that was elegant and precise. As he read the first few, he realized they were from Eleanor Barrett. The letters told a story of a family on the brink of ruin, of secrets kept and deals made in the shadows. The family had fallen victim to their own ambition, their desires twisting into something darker as they sought to maintain their wealth and power. The letters spoke of a pact, one that had been sealed in blood, promising wealth and prosperity in exchange for sacrifices that would come with a terrible cost. But as Mark read on, the tone of the letters shifted. Eleanor spoke of regret, of realizing too late that the pact had not only doomed her family, but had also trapped them in the very place they had called home. The curse had not been just an accident. It had been the result of a conscious decision made by those who thought they could control the forces of darkness. Eleanor had tried to break the curse, to free her family from its grip, but every attempt had failed. The cost was too great, and the price for freedom had been too high. Mark's heart sank as he read the final letter. In it, Eleanor begged for forgiveness, not for herself, but for the generations to come. She had done what she could, but in the end, she was just another victim of the curse she had helped create. Mark felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. He understood now. The castle had been more than a home. It had been a prison, a tomb for the sins of the past. But with the curse broken, Mark knew it was time to let go. The castle could never truly be free of its history, but he could. He turned away from the desk and looked toward the window, where the sun was beginning to set once more. The adventure had come to an end, but the journey of healing was just beginning. With Max by his side, Mark knew he could finally leave the past behind and move forward into a new chapter of his life. Mark stood there, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his chest. The letters, the discoveries, everything had come full circle. He had come to the castle seeking answers, seeking closure, but now he realized the journey had never been about the curse or the mystery of the Barrett family. It had been about him all along, about understanding the darkness within himself and the healing that only came when he was ready to face it. The room felt different now, less like a tomb and more like a place of quiet reflection. The heavy air that had once filled the halls of the castle had lifted, replaced by a calm that seemed almost unnatural. Mark turned back to Max, who was sitting quietly by the door, his eyes reflecting the same sense of relief. The dog, always by his side, had been a constant presence in the chaos, grounding him when he needed it most. Mark smiled faintly, feeling the bond they shared deepen with each passing moment. He reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, the familiar motion calming him. "We did it, buddy," Mark murmured. Max wagged his tail, his eyes warm with understanding. They had been through so much together, and now, finally, it was over. But there was still one thing left to do. Mark stepped toward the window, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of land beyond the castle walls. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the horizon. The landscape, once shrouded in shadows, now seemed full of possibility, as if the curse had not only been broken but the very land itself had been freed. He had come here to escape, to forget the past, but what he had found was far more valuable. The castle was no longer a place of suffering. It was a place of redemption. Mark's eyes narrowed as he stared at the horizon. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, not in this place that had held so many dark memories. The castle had given him the answers he needed, but now, it was time to move on. He turned to Max, a sense of finality in his heart. "Let's go home," he said softly. Together, they walked back to the front door, the key to the castle still in Mark's pocket, its power now spent. The door creaked open easily, and for the first time since he had arrived, Mark felt no resistance, no weight holding him back. He stepped outside, the cool evening air greeting him like an old friend. It was a new beginning. As Mark and Max made their way down the castle's long driveway, he couldn't help but glance back one last time. The castle loomed behind him, its silhouette now softened by the light of the setting sun. It was no longer a place of torment, but a chapter in his life that had come to an end. He had faced his demons, both the ones in the castle and the ones within himself, and he had come out stronger. The world outside the castle gates felt different, more vibrant. Mark breathed in deeply, the fresh air filling his lungs. And he knew that it was time to face the future. They had both earned it. The road ahead would not be easy, but it was a road Mark was now ready to walk. No longer weighed down by the ghosts of the past, he was free. And that freedom, he realized, was the greatest treasure of all. Mark walked on, his steps steady and sure, with Max by his side, ready for whatever came next. The past was behind them, but the future was theirs to shape. Together, they would face it, step by step. Mark and Max continued their journey down the winding path away from the castle, the fading light casting long shadows behind them. The quiet road ahead felt unfamiliar, but in the best possible way. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The weight that had burdened him for so many years, both from the war and the haunting legacy of the castle, had lifted. Max trotted beside him, his fur catching the last rays of the sun, and for a moment, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. The world was no longer a place filled with memories of loss and torment. It was a new world, a world where he could breathe, where he could move forward. As they walked, Mark thought about the years he had spent running, trying to outrun the ghosts that had followed him from the battlefield to the quiet town near the castle. He had hoped that the castle would be a place of escape, but in the end, it had been a place of revelation. The castle had forced him to confront the past, and in doing so, it had freed him from it. He had come to understand the weight of his own pain and, more importantly, how to release it. There was a lesson in that, Mark knew. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about facing what had broken you and learning to live with it. He had done that with the castle, and he could do that with his own life. As Mark glanced over at Max, he smiled. The dog had been with him through everything, loyal and steadfast, never asking questions, never judging. They had both survived the hardest of times, and now, together, they were walking into a future that held endless possibilities. It wasn't just the castle that had changed, Mark realized, it was him. He wasn't the same man who had stumbled into those dark halls, haunted by ghosts of the past. He had shed that old skin. The man who walked beside Max now was someone new, someone who had come to terms with the battles he had fought and the scars he carried. But there was one more thing he needed to do. Mark's thoughts turned back to the letters from Eleanor Barrett, the story of a family lost to the darkness. He had uncovered the truth about the curse, but there was still more to be done. The family's legacy, the history they had left behind, couldn't be allowed to fade into obscurity. They deserved to be remembered, to have their story told. Mark had the answers now, but it was up to him to share them. He couldn't let the truth be buried again, not after everything they had been through. The road ahead wasn't just a path to freedom. It was a road to redemption, to healing for not only himself, but for the Barrett family as well. Mark and Max reached a small town as the evening settled in, the sky now a deep shade of purple. They found a modest inn by the side of the road, a warm light glowing from the windows. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A bed, a meal, a roof over their heads. Mark knew that life wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt ready for whatever came next. He paid for the room and settled in for the night. Max curled up at his feet, content. As he lay back, staring at the ceiling, Mark's mind drifted back to the castle, to the moments that had defined the past week. He thought about the curse, the key, and the decision he had made to face it all head-on. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. The hardest battles were the ones fought within, and Mark had come through that fight stronger. He smiled faintly, feeling the weight of the past slowly drift away. The next day, he would begin his new life. There were still stories to tell, people to meet, and memories to create. But for now, he allowed himself the luxury of rest. Mark had earned it. The journey was far from over, but he had taken the first step. He was no longer just a soldier with a haunted past. He was a man with a future, and that future was his to shape. And as the night deepened, Mark drifted into a peaceful sleep, the quiet sound of Max's steady breathing beside him a reminder that, for the first time in a long time, he was not alone. The next morning, Mark woke early, the first light of dawn breaking through the window of the small inn. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the journey in his bones, but for the first time in a long while, it wasn't a burden. Max was still curled up at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady and calm. Mark smiled, watching his dog sleep peacefully. It had been a while since either of them had had a moment of rest. They had been through so much together, and yet, the world outside felt more open now, more welcoming. Mark stretched, and then stood, moving to the small wooden table where his belongings were scattered. The letters from Eleanor Barrett lay in his bag, their truth now etched in his mind. he could still feel the weight of them, of their secrets and their final words. The room felt lighter now, as if the castle's curse had not only been broken, but had been lifted from everything connected to it. Mark knew that the past was behind him, but the future was still unwritten, and it was time to move forward. He grabbed his bag and placed it over his shoulder, the key to the castle still tucked safely inside. He looked over at Max, who was now awake, stretching and yawning as if to say, "It's time to go." Mark nodded. "Let's go, buddy. We've got a story to tell." They stepped out into the crisp morning air, the town still quiet as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. The little inn had been a haven, a brief respite from the journey, but Mark knew that he couldn't stay here forever. There was still work to be done. He had the truth, but now he had to share it, to make sure the history of the Barrett family was remembered, not forgotten. The town was small, nestled at the edge of a great forest, but Mark knew that this was where his story needed to begin. As they walked down the main road, he saw a small community gathering place up ahead, a coffee shop with warm lights spilling from the windows. It was the perfect place to start. Mark had always been good with people. He had learned how to connect, how to listen, especially during his time in the army, when he had to understand and communicate under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't about survival, it was about healing. He needed to tell the story, not just for himself, but for the Barrett family, for Eleanor, for the generations that had been lost to the curse. He needed to make sure that the history of the castle, the price of the power that had been sought, wasn't erased. As they approached the door of the coffee shop, Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure how to begin, what to say. But then he remembered something that Eleanor had written in one of her final letters. "The truth will set you free." He wasn't sure if it was that simple, but he knew it was the right place to start. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The warm air hit him, a comforting contrast to the cool morning outside. The shop was small, cozy, with only a few tables scattered around. Behind the counter, an older woman with kind eyes and gray hair tied into a loose bun looked up as Mark entered. She smiled warmly. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I need a cup of coffee, and I think I need to tell you a story." The woman raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A story? Well, you've come to the right place for that. Sit down, make yourself comfortable, and I'll get you a fresh cup. Take your time, dear." Mark sat at one of the tables by the window, Max settling at his feet. He watched the town slowly come to life as the sun rose higher in the sky. The peace he felt was unexpected. He had faced so much darkness, so many challenges, and now, for the first time in years, he was finally able to feel the weight of the world lifting. The woman soon brought him a steaming cup of coffee, the rich scent filling the air. Mark took a sip, savoring the warmth, and then began to speak. He told the woman everything. About the castle, about the curse, about Eleanor Barrett and her family's dark past. He spoke of the pact they had made, the price they had paid, and how the curse had followed them through generations. He told her about the key, the discovery, and how it had all led to this moment. The woman listened quietly, her expression one of quiet understanding. When Mark finished, she sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "That's quite the story, sir," she said softly. "But what will you do now?" Mark leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. He hadn't really considered that part. He had been so focused on uncovering the truth that he hadn't thought much about what would come next. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to write it down, to make sure it's remembered." The woman smiled warmly. "That's a good idea. Some stories need to be told. The world can forget a lot, but the truth always has a way of coming to light." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't sure how long it would take, how far he would have to go, but he knew now that he was on the right path. He had found peace, but the journey wasn't over. He still had a story to tell, and that story was just beginning. Mark left the coffee shop with a sense of purpose, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The sun was higher now, casting a warm glow over the town, but the shadow of the castle still lingered in his mind. He had shared the story, told the truth, and yet something told him there was more to be done. He couldn't shake the feeling that his journey wasn't finished. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging gently as they walked down the quiet street. People were going about their business, unaware of the history that had just been uncovered, unaware of the curse that had once haunted the land. Mark glanced at Max, who looked up at him with those knowing eyes. They had both lived through so much, and somehow, it felt like they were ready for whatever came next. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had found peace, and that was a start. Mark decided to take the next step and return to the castle. There was no more darkness, no more curse. Only the memories of the Barrett family and the legacy they had left behind. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but something deep inside told him that the castle had one more gift for him. They made their way back to the familiar path that led to the castle. The wind had picked up, and the trees seemed to whisper as they walked. When Mark reached the gates, he stopped. The castle stood there, grand and silent, its towering walls now bathed in the light of a new day. It no longer seemed like the place of death and sorrow it had once been. Now, it seemed like a place of reflection, a place where the past could finally rest. Mark felt a sense of closure, but there was still one thing left to do. He had to go inside, to see it one last time, and to say goodbye. As he walked through the castle's great hall, Max at his side, Mark couldn't help but feel a deep connection to the place. It was as if the castle had been waiting for him to find the truth, to break the curse, and to heal. The walls no longer felt oppressive, no longer heavy with the weight of secrets. Instead, they felt welcoming, as though the castle itself had been redeemed. Mark moved through the rooms slowly, his mind drifting over the memories of the past. The family portraits, the dusty furniture, the remnants of lives that had once filled this place. All of it now felt like a story that had been told, a story that had come to an end. But there was something else, something more than just the physical space of the castle. It was the history that had been left behind, the lives that had once been here, and the love that had survived even the darkest of times. Mark walked into the library, the place where he had first uncovered the letters. The shelves were still lined with old books, the dust settling over them like a blanket. He ran his fingers across the spines, each one a reminder of the past. But now, they felt like a legacy, not a curse. He had learned the lessons he needed to learn. The Barrett family had been lost to time, their story nearly forgotten, but he had given them a voice. He had given them the chance to be remembered. Mark looked over at the fireplace, where the fire had long since died down. He thought about the letters Eleanor had written, about her final plea for forgiveness, and the way the family had fought to break the curse. In the end, they had been consumed by their own ambition, but Mark had freed them. He had broken the cycle. With a quiet sigh, Mark turned to leave. He knew that it was time. The castle no longer held the answers he sought. It had given him what he needed. He didn't need to stay here any longer. As he stepped outside, Max followed close behind. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the world felt full of promise. They stood there for a moment, looking out over the land, knowing that whatever came next would be theirs to face together. Mark smiled down at Max. "Let's go home," he said softly. They turned and walked away from the castle, leaving it behind, but carrying its lessons with them. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road of their own making. Mark knew that the future was full of possibilities, and with Max by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. They had both earned it. The journey had been long, but it had led them here, to a new beginning, and that was all that mattered. The road ahead felt open, more promising than ever before. Mark and Max walked side by side, their pace steady as they moved further from the castle, the place where so much had changed. The weight of the past that had once felt like an anchor was now a distant memory, something to be learned from, not lived in. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the land. It felt as though everything had aligned for this moment, as if the journey had led them exactly where they needed to be. As they walked, Mark found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had been searching for answers, for redemption, for peace. He had found all those things in the most unexpected of places, in the castle, in the family's lost history, and in the quiet companionship of Max. Mark had faced his demons, both the ones that haunted him from his past, and those that had lived within the castle. And with each step, he had shed a layer of the man he had once been. He was no longer the soldier consumed by guilt, nor the man lost in darkness. He was someone new, someone who understood the importance of moving forward, of carrying the lessons of the past, but not being weighed down by them. He had come to terms with what had happened at the castle. The curse had been broken, but the history, the memories, they would never be forgotten. And that was okay. The castle would remain a part of him, but it no longer had power over him. Mark could feel the winds of change stirring, not just around him, but within him. The future, once uncertain, now felt like something he could shape. And he would. The road ahead was long, but it was his to walk. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges along the way. But with Max by his side, there was nothing he couldn't face. The bond between them had been forged in the toughest of fires, and it was unbreakable. As they reached the edge of the town, Mark turned to look back one last time. The castle was now nothing more than a silhouette against the fading light, a shadow of what it once was. And in that moment, Mark realized that he had left behind more than just the castle. He had left behind the version of himself that was trapped in the past. He had left behind the fear that had once held him captive. He had stepped into the light of a new chapter. Max gave a soft bark, as if to say, "It's time." Mark smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side. He was free. And with that, they moved on. The future was theirs for the taking, and Mark knew that whatever came next, they were ready. The journey had been long, but it had led them to this moment. The moment where they could finally begin to heal, to live, and to look forward to whatever adventures awaited them. With Max by his side, Mark felt a peace he had never known. And as the sky darkened and the stars began to shine, Mark took a deep breath, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The road ahead was theirs to walk, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the past holding him back. It was time to move forward. Together.